The disturbing origins of Pinocchio's lies invites the reader into a world where a children's tale, long softened by adaptation and repetition, reveals edges far sharper than most remember. Behind the cheerful marionette and the playful notion of a nose that lengthens with every untruth lies a story conceived in an atmosphere of deep cultural unease. It emerged from a 19th century Italy struggling to define itself after unification, anxious about the unruly nature of youth, and fearful that deception was not a learned flaw but an instinctive temptation. In this environment, childhood was treated less as a protected stage of innocence, and more as a volatile space needing strict guidance, moral correction, and, when necessary, punishment. The man who shaped this narrative, Carlo Collodi, carried into his writing the imprint of political rebellion, national disillusionment, and personal skepticism. His experiences during a period marked by censorship, failed reform, and an authoritarian educational ethos infused his work with an urgent moralism. Pinocchio's lies were never meant to amuse. They were instruments designed to warn, restrain, and discipline. They reflected a society terrified that the next generation might slip free from authority and drift toward moral decay. Yet these origins are often hidden beneath the story's later, gentler versions. To trace the roots of Pinocchio's compulsive dishonesty is to walk back into a landscape where children's literature served as a vehicle for social control, where psychology was only beginning to explore the nature of deceit, and where symbolic punishment was woven deliberately into narrative structure. And so this exploration begins with a simple step. Before we can understand the lies themselves, we must first understand the world, and the mind, of the man who created them. Only then can the deeper forces that shaped his wooden child's troubled relationship with truth come into focus. To understand the unsettling roots of Pinocchio's dishonesty, one must first step into the Italy that shaped Carlo Collodi, a nation that, though freshly unified, was anything but stable. In the late 19th century, Italy was a country stitched together by politics rather than genuine cohesion, a place where regional divisions, economic crises, and ideological battles were not merely background noise but the very air Collodi breathed. It was an era marked by disorientation, suspicion, and a profound anxiety about the moral fiber of the next generation. These conditions formed the psychological soil from which the character of Pinocchio would eventually emerge. Italy's unification in 1861 did not bring serenity. Instead, it introduced a period of internal turbulence, as if a nation forced together on paper was now wrestling with the reality of its union. Formerly independent states, each with their own local customs, laws, and identities, found themselves thrust under a centralized government that was struggling to define what Italian even meant. The new nation faced poverty, illiteracy, and political fragmentation. In many regions, distrust of authority ran deep, and the government responded by implementing policies rooted not in empowerment but in control. These tensions shaped both public life and private education, filtering into the collective consciousness as worries about order, discipline, and moral decline. Collodi, living at the crossroads of this national turmoil, was not merely an observer. He had participated in political uprisings, witnessed the failures of reformist movements, and seen how governments responded to instability with tightening fists. His worldview was shaped by an Italy that feared disobedience and believed that a child left unguided could easily become a threat to the fragile social order. It was in this environment that the idea of childhood, once associated with innocence, began to transform into something unpredictable and potentially dangerous. Reformers and educators warned that the future of the nation depended on shaping obedient, disciplined citizens. Consequently, stories written for children took on the heavy burden of moral instruction. Italy's educational system at the time reflected this concern. Rather than nurturing curiosity, schools emphasized obedience, memorization, and submission to authority. Teachers were expected to function as moral gatekeepers as much as academic guides, and punishments for misbehavior were commonplace. Children were taught to fear the consequences of stepping outside rigid boundaries. The state believed that a unified national identity could be forged only through a disciplined youth, one that understood the consequences of lying, disobeying, or questioning authority. These values were not abstractions. They were codified through law, reinforced in classrooms, and echoed in literature. The broader culture mirrored this intensity. Literature in post-unification Italy often served as a didactic tool. Stories for young readers leaned toward stark moralism, portraying the consequences of wrongdoing in graphic, unflinching detail. Echoes of religious tradition blended with the authoritarian impulses of the new state, producing narratives in which children who lied or disobeyed were not gently corrected but harshly punished. This blend of fear and pedagogy reflected the nation's insecurity about its future. Generations shaped by centuries of regional loyalty now needed to be molded into citizens loyal to a unified Italy. Such a task demanded vigilance and discipline, particularly where the youngest members of society were concerned. Collodi absorbed these cultural tensions deeply. A man shaped by both rebellion and resignation, he viewed society through skeptical eyes. His early political writings reveal a sharp wit and a willingness to criticize authority, yet his later works show a shift toward caution and didacticism. This contradiction, rebellious spirit restrained by national anxiety, became central to his storytelling. Pinocchio, therefore, was born not merely as a mischievous puppet, but as a symbolic figure reflecting Italy's fears about youthful disobedience and moral instability. The rise of industrialization further fueled these anxieties. As Italy modernized, families migrated to urban centers, destabilizing traditional social structures. For many adults of Collodi's generation, the rapid pace of change created the impression that youth were becoming increasingly unruly. Newspapers published editorials lamenting the lack of discipline among children, while educators warned that deception, laziness, and defiance were becoming alarmingly common. These fears, though exaggerated, found fertile ground in a society still unsure of its future. In such an environment, the lie, particularly when told by a child, took on symbolic weight. It represented not just a moral failure but a social threat, a sign that the next generation might not uphold the fragile new order. Collodi transformed these cultural fears into narrative form. The world of the adventures of Pinocchio is built around consequences. Every lie, every moment of disobedience, every impulsive act leads to punishment or suffering. Pinocchio's dishonesty becomes more than a personal flaw. It becomes a manifestation of societal dread. The Italy of Collodi's lifetime feared that the young might reject hard-earned national values, undermining a still fragile unity. Thus, the character of Pinocchio was crafted as both a reflection and a warning. His lies were not whimsical. They were moral offenses in need of correction, symbolic of the nation's struggle to maintain control. The era's religious influence also played a crucial role. Catholicism, deeply interwoven with Italian identity, emphasized sin, confession, and redemption. Lies were not trivial misbehaviors, but moral trespasses that stained the soul. Children were taught that dishonesty could distance them from family, community, and God. This moral framework found a natural outlet in literature. Authors, including Collodi, wrote with an implicit understanding that their stories would reinforce religious values, which in turn upheld the authority of the state. Pinocchio's repeated fall into temptation, followed by suffering and eventual redemption, mirrored the Catholic cycle of sin and salvation. Yet the starkness with which Collodi portrayed punishment demonstrates a cultural climate in which fear was seen as a necessary tool for shaping behavior. Even the concept of transformation, so central to Pinocchio's story, reflected national anxieties. A puppet longing to become a real boy resonated with a country longing to become a real nation. But transformation required discipline, obedience, and moral clarity. Pinocchio's failures, therefore, symbolized fears about Italy's own inability to mature into a stable, unified state. Every lie he told echoed the nation's worries that its younger citizens might not embrace the responsibilities required to maintain unity. This interplay between personal morality and national destiny underscores the deeper significance behind the story's creation. Collodi was not writing in a vacuum. He was crafting a narrative shaped by the pressure of political change, cultural fragmentation, and widespread apprehension about the moral direction of Italy's youth. Pinocchio's dishonesty embodied these anxieties, giving them form through a character whose struggle between impulse and obedience mirrored the larger national struggle between chaos and order. And so, before the puppet ever tells his first lie, we find that the landscape in which he was created was already infused with the fears that would define his character. To grasp the weight behind Pinocchio's dishonesty, one must recognize that it was born from a society anxious about its future, vigilant about the conduct of its children, and determined to use storytelling as a tool of moral reinforcement. This context reveals why Collodi framed lying not as childish mischief, but as a symptom of deeper social instability, preparing us to follow how these tensions shaped every moral trial the puppet would face next. Long before Pinocchio ever stumbled into the world as a wayward puppet, Carlo Collodi had lived a life shaped by contradiction, part rebellion, part resignation, part idealism, part disillusionment. Understanding how this mixture of forces sculpted his later turn toward moralizing children's literature requires stepping back into the young writer's formative experiences, for they reveal the tension between his instinct to challenge authority and his eventual belief that the next generation needed firm guidance. This tension, carried silently across the years, became one of the driving forces behind the creation of a character whose lies reflected not only societal anxieties but also Collodi's own internal struggles. As a young man, Collodi was drawn to political satire, a form that allowed him to wield wit as a weapon. Italy in the mid-19th century was rife with censorship, corruption, and conflicting visions for the future, and satire offered one of the few avenues for expressing dissent. Collodi quickly proved adept at crafting sharp, ironic commentaries that poked at political actors and flawed institutions. The pseudonym Collodi, borrowed from his mother's village, allowed him a certain degree of protection, though not enough to shield him entirely from the authorities' watchful eyes. His early writings earned him both admiration and trouble, sometimes landing him under scrutiny by censors determined to silence disruptive voices. Yet these experiences forged in him a belief that language could provoke change, even when direct action failed. Collodi's political engagement did not stop on the page. During the Italian Wars of Independence, he served as a volunteer in the Tuscan army, driven by dreams of a free and unified Italy. Military life, however, introduced him to a harsher reality than the idealistic rhetoric of revolution had promised. The battlefield was chaotic, poorly managed, and marked by the same disorganization and bureaucratic incompetence he had criticized in his writings. Though he fought with conviction, the campaigns left him deeply disillusioned. Instead of triumph, he witnessed failure and frustration, and the unification process he had once supported began to appear deeply flawed. The experience did not extinguish his desire for national improvement, but it tempered his optimism with a sobering sense of what unbridled human impulsiveness, particularly among the young and inexperienced, could lead to. Returning from military service, Collodi resumed his work as a journalist and satirist, but the environment he re-entered had changed. The post-unification government, concerned with maintaining control over a still fractious nation, tightened censorship laws. Publications risked closure for even mildly seditious tones, and writers known for political sharpness found themselves under increasing pressure to soften their critiques. Collodi's work was no exception. He faced warnings, revisions, and at times complete suppression of his articles. The tension between his rebellious temperament and the state's insistence on obedience grew increasingly difficult to navigate. He found himself in the paradoxical position of wanting to expose governmental flaws while recognizing that such exposure could lead to professional danger or complete silence. It was during this period of mounting frustration that Collodi's attention began to shift. While he never abandoned his political concerns, he started exploring other genres that could accommodate his voice. Among these emerging interests was children's literature, a field that, perhaps unexpectedly, offered both freedom and influence. Unlike political satire, stories for young readers were monitored less stringently, viewed by authorities as harmless tools for moral instruction rather than potential vehicles for subversion. Yet within this space, Collodi recognized an opportunity. If he could no longer critique Italian society directly, he could shape the minds of the citizens who would one day inherit it. This realization did not occur in an instant. It grew gradually, shaped by his work on school textbooks and educational manuals, which he took on to support himself financially. These texts required clarity, simplicity, and moral guidance, skills that would become essential in his later writing. Though the work may have seemed mundane, it provided him with insight into how children absorbed information, how they responded to narrative, and how stories could subtly reinforce desired values. The rigid structure of educational materials also exposed him to the dominant moral philosophy of the era, one emphasizing obedience, honesty, and civic duty. Over time, he began to see children's literature not as a retreat from political engagement, but as a different mode of ideological participation. The transition from satirist to moral storyteller may appear contradictory, yet the connection becomes clearer when one considers Collodi's evolving view of Italian society. His political failures, his disillusionment with the government, and his frustrations with adult intransigence all contributed to a growing belief that systemic change was unlikely to come from the existing ruling class. The youth, however, still malleable and not yet corrupted by politics, represented a new frontier. By shaping children's values through literature, Collodi could indirectly influence the future of his country. The rebellious writer had not abandoned his desire for reform. He had redirected it. This redirection helps explain the dual nature of Pinocchio as a character. On the one hand, the puppet embodies impulsiveness, disobedience, and a tendency toward deception, the very traits Collodi associated with the failures he witnessed in adults and in the political system. On the other hand, Pinocchio's journey is one of correction, discipline, and gradual moral awakening. Collodi was not merely entertaining young readers. He was modeling the process of internal reform he believed Italy itself needed. The story's moral arc reflects the writer's shift from satirical critique to constructive, if stern, guidance. Yet Collodi's earlier experiences remained embedded in his storytelling. His exposure to censorship fostered a sense of caution, leading him to embed lessons within allegory rather than explicit criticism. His military service gave him an understanding of the consequences of unrestrained behavior, shaping the severe punishments Pinocchio faces. His satire taught him the power of exaggeration, which he employed through hyperbolic episodes designed to imprint moral lessons with unforgettable clarity. All these elements converged in a narrative that, though intended for children, carried the weight of a lifetime's political and personal history. Thus, when Collodi turned to children's literature, he did not abandon his past. He transformed it. His early rebellion became moral rigor, his frustration became instruction, and his national hopes found a new vessel in a wooden puppet whose struggles mirrored the turbulent society that produced him. Understanding this transformation is essential for recognizing why Pinocchio's lies carry such profound significance, for they were shaped not just by cultural anxiety, but by the inner evolution of the man who created them. When Pinocchio first appeared in 1881 within the pages of the Giornale per I Bambini, he was not presented as the lovable cultural mascot he would later become. Instead, he emerged within a tradition of serialized moral narratives meant to correct, chastise, and warn. This origin is essential to understanding why the early chapters of his story feel so stark, so punitive, and so heavily invested in consequence. Collodi was not yet creating a whimsical hero. He was constructing a figure through whom he could express the anxieties, frustrations, and moral imperatives of his era. The tone of these initial installments was severe, shaped by a belief that children, like nations, needed discipline before they could develop into something worthy of pride. The serialized format itself influenced the intensity of the story. Each chapter needed to grip young readers not merely through wonder, but through the promise of moral instruction. Italian children's periodicals at the time functioned almost like classrooms on paper, their stories expected to reinforce proper behavior through vivid depictions of what happened to those who strayed. Collodi leaned into this mandate with precision. From the very moment Pinocchio takes shape from a block of mischievous wood, the narrative thrust centers on the puppet's refusal to follow rules and his immediate immersion in wrongdoing. Rather than presenting his misbehavior as playful, Collodi frames it as dangerous, even life-threatening. It is striking how quickly the early installments escalate toward violence. Pinocchio's first independent actions, running away from home, mocking authority, rejecting advice, are met with escalating consequences. The world around him responds not with indulgence or patience, but with sharp reprimand and physical punishment, reflecting the educational philosophy of the era. Children were believed to learn best through fear and suffering, and Collodi translated that belief directly into the structure of his story. The puppet's errors are not symbolic or minor. They are treated as transgressions demanding immediate correction. This severity becomes even more apparent when examining how Pinocchio's earliest readers would have interpreted the story. In a society where child mortality was still common and corporal punishment was widely accepted, danger was not an abstract concept but a daily reality. Parents and educators considered the fear of peril an effective means of shaping obedience. Thus, when Collodi placed Pinocchio in lethal situations, he was not straying into sensationalism. He was adhering to the moral expectations of his readership. The puppet's vulnerability served as a reminder that life punished recklessness, and that survival depended on heeding the guidance of elders. One of the most revealing aspects of the original serialization is how Collodi initially intended to end the story. Long before the Blue Fairy, the Island of Toys, or the redemptive conclusion that modern audiences recognize, Pinocchio's journey was meant to conclude abruptly and grimly. In the 1881 ending, the puppet hangs from a tree, dying slowly as a consequence of his refusal to reform. This scene was not portrayed metaphorically. Collodi described the hanging with a starkness that left no ambiguity. Pinocchio, suspended by the neck, is left to sway in the wind as the chapter fades to black. For the writer's contemporaries, this was not merely a tragic ending, but a moral warning rendered with surgical clarity. Disobedience leads to destruction. The decision to kill the protagonist so brutally reveals how Collodi viewed the story, at least initially. Pinocchio was never meant to be a comforting presence. He was a vessel through which the dangers of impulsiveness and dishonesty could be dramatized. The hanging served as the ultimate didactic gesture, reinforcing the belief that those who refused to learn would suffer the final, irreversible punishment. This ending aligned with the serialized moral tales common in the era, many of which depicted children being permanently harmed by their own misbehavior. It also reflected Collodi's prevailing belief that narrative severity was essential for shaping young minds. But the reaction from readers shifted the direction of the story. The editor of the Giornale per I Bambini received letters from children who were horrified by Pinocchio's death. Parents, too, voiced their discomfort. The outcry was significant enough that Collodi was persuaded to continue the story, bringing the puppet back to life and expanding his adventures. Yet even in this continuation, the punitive tone remained. The resurrection did not soften the story. It merely extended the space within which Pinocchio could face further moral testing. Each new episode continued to present hazards, deceptions, and suffering as inevitable consequences of disobedience. The fact that Pinocchio survived his hanging did not erase the meaning of the scene. Instead, it served as a stark reminder that the story's foundation was built on caution rather than celebration. Collodi's willingness to kill his protagonist, however briefly, reveals the seriousness with which he approached children's education. He believed that literature for the young needed to reflect the harshness of life, not shield them from it. The puppet's body became a canvas upon which the consequences of moral failure could be inscribed, and his temporary death underscored the ultimate stakes of straying from the path of virtue. This approach also mirrored Collodi's broader shift from political satire to moral instruction. In satire, consequences often fell on corrupt leaders or flawed institutions. In children's literature, they fell on the individual. Pinocchio's suffering thus became an allegory for the nation's future. A child who learned through pain would grow into a responsible adult, capable of contributing to Italy's stability. A child who ignored warnings would invite disaster, both personally and collectively. In this way, the serialized story served a dual purpose, entertaining young readers while reinforcing the values deemed essential for national unity. The puppet's early fate, nearly cut short by his own choices, also reflected Collodi's evolving cynicism. Having witnessed political failure and societal fragmentation, he no longer believed that people matured naturally into better versions of themselves. Improvement required constant correction. Pinocchio's world, therefore, became one in which every misstep triggered an immediate response, as though the universe itself were aligned against waywardness. This harsh moral landscape was not an artistic exaggeration. It was Collodi's interpretation of how fragile and easily disrupted moral order could be. By the time the extended version of the story took shape, the foundation had already been laid. Pinocchio's purpose was caution first, entertainment second. The remnants of the original ending lingered throughout the narrative, giving even the lightest moments a shadow of warning. Beneath the humor, beneath the wonder, beneath the fantastical elements that would later charm generations, the story retained the skeleton of its original function, a tool crafted to correct behavior, shaped by an era that believed truth and obedience were the only safeguards against chaos. To understand why Pinocchio's lies carry such weight, why they trigger punishment, humiliation, and moral consequences rather than amusement, one must examine how lying was perceived in 19th-century Italy. In Collodi's era, dishonesty was not treated as a childish phase or a psychological curiosity. It was framed as a form of social deviance, a precursor to delinquency, and a warning sign that a child's moral development was veering dangerously off course. This cultural attitude did not arise in isolation. It was shaped by political insecurity, religious doctrine, educational reform, and the era's emerging interest in the contours of criminal behavior. To fully grasp the severity with which Collodi approached Pinocchio's dishonesty, it is necessary to explore how moral educators, parents, and the state understood the lie as a threat not merely to the family but to society itself. In the late 1800s, Italy was still defining its national identity. The fragile new state believed it could not afford a generation of untrustworthy citizens. As a result, children's character was monitored with vigilance, and certain misbehaviors were disproportionately feared. Among these, lying ranked at the top. Moral education manuals written for parents and teachers described dishonesty as the first step toward criminality, warning that a child who lied easily could grow into an adult capable of theft, fraud, or betrayal. The idea that small untruths could snowball into moral ruin permeated both religious and secular discourse. A lie was not a slip of the tongue. It was evidence of a corruptible nature. Educational reformers echoed this sentiment. In classrooms across Italy, teachers were instructed to discipline dishonesty with firmness, sometimes with public shaming or corporal punishment. Reports from the period describe schoolrooms where children caught lying were forced to kneel before the class, wear signs around their necks, or endure prolonged isolation. The prevailing philosophy held that a child must associate lying with discomfort, embarrassment, or pain so strongly that truthfulness became an instinct rather than a choice. These practices were not considered extreme. They were seen as necessary protections against future deviance. This strict approach was reinforced by emerging fields such as early criminology and social hygiene, which sought to identify the roots of antisocial behavior. Thinkers like Cesare Lombroso, though controversial even in their time, popularized the idea that criminal tendencies could be detected in childhood habits. Lying, in this framework, was among the earliest behavioral markers of a potentially dangerous adult. While not every teacher or parent accepted Lombroso's theories outright, the broader cultural anxiety he amplified helped entrench the belief that dishonesty represented a form of moral pathology. Children who lied were not simply mischievous. They were flirting with a darker future. Religious instruction deepened these concerns. Catholic doctrine equated lying with sin, framing it as a violation of divine law rather than merely a disruption of social order. Confessional practice emphasized truthfulness as essential to salvation, and sermons warned that each lie distanced the soul from God. For many families, this spiritual dimension made dishonesty feel profoundly dangerous, something that could stain a child's moral integrity. The fear was not solely that lying would lead to criminality, but that it would cultivate a habit of moral evasion incompatible with the virtues required of a good Christian citizen. In this sense, Pinocchio's lies carried not just social weight but spiritual menace. Collodi absorbed these cultural messages and wove them tightly into the fabric of his story. When Pinocchio lies, his wooden body reacts not gently but grotesquely, as though the lie itself were a physical deformation. This fantastical transformation reflects the era's belief that dishonesty disfigured a child's moral character, making the inner defect visible. The growing nose became more than a narrative gimmick. It became an embodiment of societal fears that lies left permanent marks, that they altered a child in ways that could not be easily reversed. Collodi transformed a cultural metaphor into a literal one, giving the abstract dread surrounding dishonesty a vivid, unforgettable form. The educational texts of the time offer further insight into how deeply the fear of lying was ingrained. Manuals for teachers warned that permissiveness toward dishonesty invited chaos into the classroom, undermining all authority. They insisted that children must learn to associate truth-telling with virtue, order, and societal harmony. The ideal child was one whose conscience was so finely tuned that deceit caused immediate discomfort. Collodi's depiction of Pinocchio's shame when confronted with his growing nose mirrors these lessons. The puppet's humiliation is not incidental, it is pedagogical. His body betrays him, exposing his moral failing before others can. This serves as a narrative enforcement of the values educators sought to instill through discipline. Parallel to these educational concerns was a growing public fear of juvenile delinquency. Urbanization, economic instability, and uneven access to schooling contributed to a sense of social fragility. Newspapers published stories about pickpocketing youths, runaway children, and street gangs, feeding the perception that a generation was slipping away from moral guidance. Authorities feared that if children were not taught honesty, obedience, and respect, they would become adults who posed risks to public order. In such an atmosphere, even small acts of disobedience were scrutinized, and lying became a symbolic gateway to societal disorder. Collodi, who had witnessed the failures of political institutions and the fragility of national unity, understood how precarious the nation felt. The severity with which he portrayed Pinocchio's lies mirrored the severity with which society viewed the moral formation of children. Yet the fear of dishonesty also had roots in the structure of the family. In many households, a child's reputation was inseparable from the family's honor. A lying child risked not only personal moral decline, but also the erosion of familial trust and respectability. Parents who struggled to maintain authority in a rapidly changing world viewed honesty as a pillar of stability. If that pillar cracked, they feared the entire household might falter. Collodi's story reflects this domestic anxiety, particularly in the fraught relationship between Pinocchio and Geppetto. The puppet's lies do not simply harm himself. They betray his father's hopes and deepen the rift between them. This dynamic underscores how dishonesty was understood as both a personal and relational failing, capable of wounding the very fabric of family life. These intertwined fears, social, religious, educational, and domestic, explain why Collodi crafted a world in which lying is met with immediate consequence. Pinocchio's environment is structured to expose deception, to punish it swiftly, and to link it unambiguously with suffering. Even when the punishments veer into exaggeration, their moral underpinnings remain consistent with the beliefs of his time. The puppet must learn the truth not by gentle persuasion, but through a sequence of humiliations and hardships, reflecting a widespread conviction that moral lessons were best absorbed through discomfort. Collodi was not inventing this philosophy. He was channeling the dominant view that children, left unchecked, would naturally drift toward moral peril. This context allows us to see why Pinocchio's lies are never trivial within the narrative. Each untruth carries the weight of societal anxiety about the next generation, about the fragility of personal integrity, and about the nation's uncertain future. The puppet is not simply learning to behave. He is undergoing a process of moral rehabilitation shaped by the fears and doctrines of his era. His body betrays his failings, his community reacts with condemnation, and his journey becomes an embodiment of a society desperate to mold trustworthy citizens from children who, like him, seemed prone to waywardness. By understanding the cultural severity with which lying was viewed, Pinocchio's trials become clearer. They reflect a world where dishonesty was treated as a moral emergency, where the future depended on the character of children, and where stories served as tools to discipline as much as entertain. In this landscape, Pinocchio's lies were never mere mischief. They were warnings, written for a generation that believed truthfulness was the cornerstone upon which a fragile national identity depended. From the moment Pinocchio's nose begins to grow, the image seems almost whimsical to a modern audience, a clever visual gag that has survived through countless adaptations and parodies. Yet in Collodi's time, the symbolism of a lengthening nose carried nothing of the playful innocence audiences now associate with it. Instead, it drew from a deep well of European artistic, moral, and pseudo-scientific tradition in which the nose was not merely a feature of the face, but a canvas upon which character, guilt, and inner corruption were publicly inscribed. To understand why Collodi selected this particular form of punishment, one must recognize how a long nose functioned historically as both accusation and evidence, something that exposed a wrongdoer before they even opened their mouth. The transformation of nose growth from metaphor into physical consequence in Pinocchio was therefore not invented out of the blue. It was a deliberate weaponization of a symbol already widely associated with deceit, shame, and moral deviation. The roots of this symbolism reach back to medieval European art, where physical exaggeration routinely signaled internal vice. The nose, protruding from the face more prominently than almost any other feature, became a natural candidate for metaphorical distortion. Caricatures of liars, cheats, and swindlers often depicted them with noses warped by dishonesty, elongated to suggest intrusive meddling or twisted to reflect crooked morality. These artistic traditions survived into the Renaissance, where painters and engravers used the nose to hint at a person's reputation or suspected moral failings. Even characters with no explicit narrative of deception were visually coded as untrustworthy through nasal exaggeration, giving viewers an immediate, intuitive sense of who should not be believed. While artistic exaggeration was one source of the symbol's longevity, folklore provided another. In several European traditions, a long nose was believed to reveal a person dabbling in trickery or falsehood. Some Italian folk tales warned children that those who lied would carry the mark of deceit on their faces, visible to everyone and impossible to hide. These stories were not mere entertainment. They functioned as moral enforcement tools in a culture deeply concerned with obedience, reputation, and social order. The nose, visible and impossible to disguise, operated as both warning and punishment. Collodi, familiar with these traditions, would have recognized the powerful psychological effect of transforming this metaphor into literal truth within his narrative. However, the most striking influence on Collodi's symbolic choice came not from folklore or art alone, but from the emerging field of 19th-century criminology. During Collodi's lifetime, Europe was gripped by the belief that physical features could reveal criminal tendencies. Thinkers like Cesare Lombroso, whose work surged in influence during the late 1800s, argued that criminals bore visible markers of their innate deviance. Although Lombroso's theories were later discredited, at the time they were widely accepted and permeated public consciousness. Among the indicators Lombroso and his followers emphasized were abnormalities or exaggerated features of the head and face. The nose, due to its centrality and variability, became a prime focus. A long or sharply pointed nose could be interpreted as aggressive, deceitful, manipulative, or morally flawed. This pseudoscientific movement did not merely theorize about facial features. It seeped into popular literature, moral education, and even children's stories. The belief that one's moral condition could be displayed on one's face validated punitive approaches to childhood behavior, reinforcing the notion that misdeeds carried visible consequences. Collodi, who lived in a society saturated with these ideas, absorbed their essence. He did not need to explain to his readers why a liar's nose would grow. The symbolism was already culturally loaded. The act functioned as both punishment and clarity, a way of demonstrating that deceit could not remain hidden, that the body itself betrayed wrongdoing. In Pinocchio's case, the growing nose operates on multiple levels. On the surface, it appears as a simple moral mechanism: lie, and the nose extends. But in the context of 19th-century ideology, it becomes a far more pointed statement. Collodi turns the nose into a device of public humiliation. Pinocchio cannot conceal his dishonesty because his body exposes him more ruthlessly than any authority figure could. This reflects a society deeply invested in surveillance, where children were expected not only to obey but to internalize watchfulness, an awareness that misbehavior would be revealed, whether by parents, teachers, or, in this case, the child's own anatomy. The growth of the nose also reflects anxieties about uncontrollable consequences. In Collodi's original narrative, the nose does not simply grow a little. It expands grotesquely, becoming unwieldy and absurd. This exaggeration conveys a specific cultural message. Lies, once told, spiral beyond the liar's control, leading to compounding shame and entrapment. Pinocchio is physically hindered by his dishonesty, unable to move, to hide, or to correct his situation until he confesses. The symbolism here mirrors contemporary moral instruction, which emphasized confession as essential to moral rehabilitation. In a society where public acknowledgement of wrongdoing was central to discipline, the nose made secret guilt impossible. Yet Collodi's choice was not only punitive, it was pedagogical. By choosing a form of punishment that directly visualized the lie, he offered children an immediate, intuitive understanding of moral cause and effect. The punishment was not abstract or delayed. It was instantaneous, visible, and humiliating, precisely the kind of moral lesson intended to shape behavior through fear. The imagery of the nose, deeply rooted in European tradition, strengthened the effect, making it resonate not only with children but also with the adults who were the true interpreters of the story. As these layers of symbolism converge, the nose becomes more than a quirk of character design. It embodies the intersection of folklore, pseudoscience, religious morality, and social anxiety. Collodi, drawing from these sources, sculpted a punishment that conveyed both the inevitability of truth and the dangers of deviating from prescribed behavior. And yet, to fully grasp the narrative's darker intentions, one must look beyond the symbolic shame of the nose to the wider pattern of punishments Collodi embedded in the tale, many of which drew from even harsher traditions of discipline and retribution. For many readers today, Pinocchio's lies seem like a simple narrative device, a way to signal misbehavior, evoke humor, or teach a mild lesson about honesty. But in the cultural and religious landscape in which Collodi lived, lying was not merely a childish mistake. It was sin. And sin, in Catholic doctrine, carried spiritual weight far heavier than any wooden nose could convey. To understand how Pinocchio's dishonesty functions within the story, It is necessary to understand the religious world that shaped Collodi and his audience, a world in which moral instruction, guilt, and repentance formed the bedrock of childhood education. Catholicism's pervasive influence made deception more than an act of disobedience. It became a breach in the moral fabric of the soul, requiring exposure, contrition, and penance. This spiritual architecture informed Collodi's narrative so profoundly that Pinocchio's lies cannot be examined without stepping into the shadow of Catholic guilt that enveloped 19th-century Italy. Catholic teaching on sin was inseparable from daily life. Children were raised not only with the awareness that wrongdoing displeased parents or teachers, but with the deeper fear that misbehavior jeopardized their relationship with God. Sin was categorized, catalogued, and carefully defined, and lying occupied a prominent place in moral instruction. Catechisms taught that bearing false witness was not simply immoral but spiritually dangerous, a violation of one of the 10 Commandments. Even seemingly small lies were presented as cracks in the moral structure of the self, cracks that, if ignored, widened into more serious sins. In an age when religious education was woven into every layer of schooling and family life, the gravity of dishonesty weighed heavily on young minds. Confession, a sacrament central to Catholic practice, reinforced this worldview. From an early age, children learned that the only true path to cleansing one's conscience was to admit wrongdoing to a priest and express genuine remorse. Confession was not merely a ritual. It was a mechanism of moral surveillance. It trained children to examine their own behavior constantly, to recognize guilt within themselves, and to articulate that guilt before an authority who represented divine judgment. This emphasis on confession shaped not only religious practice but broader cultural notions of truth-telling. Honesty became synonymous with purity, while lying became a stain that demanded acknowledgement and correction. In this context, Pinocchio's lies resonate far beyond the realm of childish mischief. Each lie reflects a spiritual deviation, a step away from innocence and toward moral danger. The immediate consequence, his nose growing, functions as an externalization of the inner corruption that Catholic doctrine claimed sin produced. Pinocchio's body, unable to hide the moral stain, becomes the confessor that forces him to confront his own transgression. There is no place for secrecy. The physical world itself betrays him. This parallels Catholic teachings in which sin, no matter how hidden, is never truly concealed. Divine judgment sees what the sinner attempts to hide, and conscience amplifies it until confession becomes unavoidable. Moreover, the narrative rhythm of sin, punishment, and redemption that structures Pinocchio's journey mirrors the Catholic cycle of guilt and forgiveness. Pinocchio sins through deceit, suffers consequences, seeks forgiveness, and temporarily reforms before falling again. This pattern is not accidental. It is the moral arc embedded in Catholic pedagogy. Collodi, shaped by a culture that viewed moral development as a continual struggle between temptation and virtue, infused his story with the same repetitive nature of sin and repentance that defined the sacramental life of Catholics. Pinocchio's failures are thus not just narrative setbacks, but moral lapses in the tradition of religious instruction. The severity with which Pinocchio's dishonesty is treated reflects Catholic attitudes toward moral discipline in the 19th century. Children were perceived as naturally inclined toward wrongdoing, inclined, in theological terms, toward sin, unless guided firmly by authority. Moral education aimed not to celebrate childhood innocence, but to correct and discipline. Tales of punishment were common tools in this process. Stories that made sin visible, frightening, or humiliating were used to deter wrongdoing. Collodi's depiction of the growing nose fits into this tradition perfectly. It renders dishonesty grotesquely visible, instilling fear and shame in both character and reader. The story becomes a cautionary tale in the tradition of religious moralism. Sin reveals itself, and no sinner escapes exposure. The blue fairy plays a crucial symbolic role in this religious framework. While not explicitly divine, she functions as a figure of grace, guidance, and mercy, qualities associated with the Virgin Mary in Catholic devotion. Her presence introduces the possibility of forgiveness, but always with the condition of honesty and repentance. When Pinocchio lies to her, it is not merely disobedience but spiritual betrayal. Her disappointment reflects the sorrow of a divine figure wounded by sin. Yet she also offers redemption, reinforcing the Catholic message that forgiveness is always available to the contrite. This dynamic transforms the story from a simple moral fable into a narrative shaped by religious themes of transgression, penance, and salvation. Even the emotional tone of Pinocchio's encounters with guilt aligns with Catholic teachings. Pinocchio often experiences fear, shame, and self-reproach before he confesses. These emotions were central to Catholic moral development. Guilt was not viewed as harmful but as necessary, an internal alarm signaling the need for correction. Religious instruction encouraged children to feel guilt deeply, to internalize moral failure so thoroughly that confession became a relief rather than a burden. Pinocchio's remorse, when it finally emerges, mirrors the spiritual catharsis of confession. His transformation afterward, though temporary, represents the momentary purity granted through absolution. The broader atmosphere of guilt surrounding Pinocchio's deceit reflects a society in which religious morality permeated even secular literature. Collodi did not write a religious text, yet his worldview was shaped by Catholic norms that influenced everything from public schooling to political rhetoric. Moral stories were expected to reflect Catholic virtues, reinforcing obedience, honesty, and humility. The dangers of deceit were thus amplified through both religious and cultural lenses, making Pinocchio's lies doubly transgressive, socially disruptive, and spiritually dangerous. This intertwining of religious doctrine and narrative punishment becomes even clearer when observing how Pinocchio's lies escalate his suffering. In Catholic teaching, sin leads to spiritual and sometimes physical consequences. Collodi translates this into narrative reality. Pinocchio's lies do not isolate him as private failings but propel him into greater dangers, symbolizing how sin leads the soul toward further corruption if left unchecked. His dishonesty attracts predators, misfortune, and hardship, reinforcing the Catholic idea that sin weakens the individual, leaving them vulnerable to greater evil. As these elements combine, Pinocchio's dishonesty emerges as far more than a character flaw. It becomes a representation of moral and spiritual deviation shaped by Catholic teaching. And yet, to fully appreciate how Collodi translated these religious ideas into narrative structure, it is essential to examine the wider moral ecosystem of the story, one where punishment, shame, and fear intersect with social anxieties far beyond the Church's influence. The question of why children lie, and whether dishonesty emerges naturally or is shaped by environment, was one that preoccupied many thinkers in the late 19th century. It was a period when childhood was no longer seen simply as a smaller version of adulthood, but as a distinct developmental stage marked by impulses, vulnerabilities, and innate tendencies that required management and control. This emerging view was shaped by educators, physicians, early psychologists, and moralists who attempted to map the inner landscape of the child, often with the assumption that the child's natural state was chaotic and morally unstable. Within this framework, Pinocchio occupies a revealing symbolic position. He is both puppet and child, constructed rather than born, animated rather than conceived, yet his dishonesty, impulsiveness, and defiance mirror the anxieties adults projected onto real children of the era. To understand the deeper meaning of his lies, one must consider the psychological theories gaining traction during Collodi's lifetime, theories that cast the child as a creature whose instincts leaned toward deception unless shaped by firm discipline. The 19th century witnessed the rise of child study movements across Europe, movements that attempted to classify and understand children through empirical observation. One of their central preoccupations was the belief that children were naturally inclined to lie. This belief did not emerge randomly. It reflected a broader cultural assumption that the child's mind, unformed and undisciplined, was prone to flights of imagination that blurred into falsehood. Early educational texts frequently portrayed lying not as a moral anomaly, but as a developmental inevitability, a stage through which all children passed and from which only strict guidance could rescue them. These studies position the child as a being caught between instinct and instruction, between inner impulse and external authority. The emphasis fell on the need to tame these impulses so that the child could eventually be trusted to govern their own behavior. Pinocchio, in this context, becomes a dramatized embodiment of this psychological model. He enters the world as a blank slate, yet from his first steps he gravitates toward misbehavior. His lies are spontaneous, unpremeditated, and often unnecessary, reflecting the belief among many 19th-century psychologists that childish deceit stemmed from impulse rather than malice. In their view, children lied because they sought pleasure, wished to avoid punishment, or simply enjoyed the thrill of invention. Pinocchio's dishonesty follows this model precisely. He lies not out of strategic calculation, but from instinctive avoidance of discomfort and an immediate desire to shape reality according to his whims. At the same time, Pinocchio's status as a puppet deepens the psychological symbolism. As a wooden figure brought to life, he represents the child whose instincts have not yet been transformed into moral agency. The puppet metaphor suggests malleability combined with lack of self-control, movement granted from outside yet guided by nothing stable within. Early psychologists often described children in similar terms, emphasizing their suggestibility and vulnerability to external influences. They were shaped, pulled, and directed by the adults around them. Without proper guidance, they wandered toward disorder. Pinocchio's repeated failures therefore illustrate the perceived dangers of a child left to his own devices, one who follows instinct over instruction, impulse over discipline. The fear underlying these theories was not merely that children lied, but that they lied because their inner nature was untamed. This notion emerged alongside growing interest in evolutionary theory, which encouraged thinkers to view child development as a recapitulation of humanity's earlier, more primitive stages. Children were imagined as representing an earlier, less civilized version of the human species, closer to instinct than reason, closer to emotion than self-restraint. Dishonesty, in this model, became a relic of primitive survival behavior, a way to navigate danger or seek advantage in a hostile environment. If children lied instinctively, this suggested that the seeds of deceit were embedded deeply within human nature, and that the process of civilization depended on rooting them out early. Pinocchio's portrayal reflects this evolutionary anxiety. His lies are not sophisticated but primitive. He lies because he wants immediate gratification, because he fears punishment, because he wishes to appear better than he is. These motivations align closely with the child psychology of the time, which interpreted such behavior as a sign of incomplete moral formation. The puppet has not yet become a real boy, and that transformation symbolizes far more than the passage from childhood to adolescence. It represents the psychological progression from instinctual behavior to disciplined self-governance. Pinocchio's lies, therefore, signify his incomplete humanity, his lingering proximity to the primitive, untamed state that early psychology believed characterized the young. At the same time, psychological theorists of the 19th century were increasingly concerned with the environment's role in shaping children's behavior. They debated whether dishonesty was inherent or learned, whether it reflected internal weakness or external corruption. This question parallels the narrative tension within Pinocchio's story. The puppet lies on his own, yet he is surrounded by figures, foxes, cats, puppeteers, idle boys, who encourage or exploit his dishonesty. Collodi seems to acknowledge both forces. Pinocchio's impulses are his own, but the world around him provides countless opportunities and temptations that magnify them. This duality reflects contemporary psychological debates, which rarely landed decisively on nature or nurture, but instead illustrated the interplay between the two. Pinocchio's journey can thus be read as a psychological case study. Each episode represents a different type of temptation or developmental challenge. His lies to the Blue Fairy are rooted in fear. His lies to himself, promises of improvement that he quickly breaks, reflect a lack of self-understanding, another theme in child psychology of the era. Psychologists noted that children often overestimated their abilities or intentions, not because they intended deception, but because they lacked the introspective maturity to distinguish desire from reality. Pinocchio's self-deception, in this sense, mirrors the psychological belief that children's minds were fluid, imaginative, and unstable, requiring guidance to separate truth from wishful thinking. The transformation into a real boy represents the resolution of these anxieties. It is not merely magical, it is psychological. To become real is to internalize discipline, to develop self-control, to align intention with action. It symbolizes the child who has moved beyond instinct and acquired moral consciousness. Pinocchio's wooden body, stiff and subject to external forces, becomes human only when he accepts responsibility for his actions. In this sense, his dishonesty is not simply punished. It is understood as part of a developmental process culminating in maturity. This narrative arc echoes the emerging psychological belief that children could be shaped into rational, honest adults through a combination of discipline, education, and moral guidance. These psychological fears and aspirations did not exist in isolation. They intersected with cultural, religious, and social anxieties that permeated Collodi's world, creating a narrative in which lying symbolized not only personal failure but a threat to society's fragile hold on order. And yet, even this broader cultural context cannot fully explain the intensity of the punishments Pinocchio faces, punishments that often go beyond psychological correction and enter the realm of physical danger, revealing a darker tradition of child discipline that shaped the story's moral landscape. When readers encounter modern editions of Pinocchio, they often assume the story was always destined to end with redemption, transformation, and a comforting moral conclusion. Yet Collodi's original text carried a far harsher vision, one that culminated in the puppet's execution by hanging. This ending, shocking to contemporary sensibilities, was neither accidental nor a fleeting experiment. It reflected a deeply rooted cultural belief that certain moral failures, particularly deception, were not mere misbehaviors but violations severe enough to warrant absolute punishment. In Collodi's world, dishonesty was not a childish error but a destabilizing force threatening family, society, and the fragile moral order. To understand why Pinocchio's story originally terminated at the gallows, one must consider the symbolic weight execution held in the 19th century, and how Collodi's narrative transformed the punishment for lying into a dramatic lesson about social survival. Hanging, in the context of the time, was not only a method of execution but a public spectacle that communicated moral boundaries. Although Italy had abolished many forms of capital punishment by the late 1800s, memories of public executions remained vivid in the cultural imagination. The gallows had served for centuries as a visible symbol of societal judgment, marking the boundary between acceptable behavior and actions deemed unforgivable. Even as the practice declined, the symbolism endured. Writers, moralists, and educators invoked the image of execution to convey the severity of wrongdoing, using it as a cautionary tool to deter behaviors considered corrosive to social cohesion. Collodi, steeped in these traditions, employed the imagery not for shock alone, but to situate Pinocchio within this lineage of moral consequence. The scene in which Pinocchio is ambushed by the fox and the cat and left hanging from a tree is framed with a starkness that leaves little ambiguity. This is no accidental misfortune. It is portrayed as the culmination of his choices. Throughout the early chapters, Pinocchio repeatedly ignores warnings, deceives those who care for him, and gravitates toward those who exploit him. When he is finally captured, the narrative treats his impending death with a grim inevitability. The puppet is suspended between life and death, his body dangling as a visual manifestation of the moral downfall that began with seemingly harmless lies. In Collodi's original vision, lying is not a minor infraction but a path that leads directly to destruction. This narrative logic reflects the moral atmosphere of Collodi's Italy, where dishonesty was associated not only with personal failing but with broader social decay. In a society struggling to unify politically and culturally, trust was a precious commodity. Deception was viewed as a corrosive force that threatened collective stability. Literature, sermons, and educational manuals frequently warned that lies, once allowed to flourish, could undermine the integrity of families, corrupt public life, and foster criminality. Children were taught that dishonesty set them on a path toward moral ruin, one that could eventually lead to punishment as severe as those faced by adult criminals. Collodi's decision to end the story at the gallows thus aligned with prevailing beliefs that lying was intrinsically linked to degeneration and danger. At the same time, the execution scene draws from the long-standing tradition of punitive fairy tales in which misbehavior results in violent or fatal consequences. Pre-modern children's stories often employed extreme punishments as moral lessons. Characters who lied, stole, or disobeyed authority were frequently maimed, killed, or damned. These tales, however harsh, reflected an era when fear was considered an effective pedagogical tool. Collodi, despite writing in a more modern context, retained this tradition, using the threat of death to illustrate the seriousness of moral deviation. The hanging scene becomes the apex of this pedagogical severity, a final warning that deprives the character, and the reader, of the safety net modern adaptations take for granted. Yet the symbolism of Pinocchio's hanging extends beyond moral instruction. It also resonates with the puppet's dual identity as object and creature. As a wooden figure animated by life, Pinocchio straddles the boundary between human and non-human. His hanging evokes the image of a puppet suspended by strings, a symbolic return to the inert state from which he emerged. This visual metaphor reinforces the idea that moral failure strips him of the human qualities he seeks to attain. Dishonesty, in this reading, is not merely punished but dehumanized, reducing the character back to lifeless material. The gallows become not only an instrument of execution but a symbol of regression, a failure to evolve into moral agency. The severity of this punishment also reflects emerging anxieties about juvenile delinquency in the 19th century. As cities expanded and literacy increased, society became more aware of youth misbehavior and perceived it as a significant threat. Newspapers printed sensational stories about young criminals, often attributing their downfall to early dishonesty or disobedience. Reformers debated how to discipline errant children, with some advocating for more humane approaches while others insisted on harsh deterrents. Collodi's story, written in this climate, reflects the latter view, that a child's descent into deviance begins with the smallest act of untruthfulness, and if unchecked, ends in catastrophe. The execution scene thus dramatizes the extreme endpoint of a trajectory that contemporary educators fervently believed was real. Despite the grimness of the original ending, the narrative's function was not simply punitive. Collodi intended the shock of Pinocchio's execution to compel both children and adults to confront the consequences of moral failure. The abruptness of the ending served as a moral jolt, emphasizing that redemption is not guaranteed. In a society governed by strict codes of behavior and deeply influenced by religious and civic expectations, the story's termination at the gallows reinforced the belief that wrongdoing carries irrevocable consequences. It was a narrative designed to leave a mark, to provoke reflection rather than comfort. Yet even as Collodi wielded this harsh moral tool, the public response ultimately altered the story's trajectory. Readers reacted strongly to the execution scene, prompting Collodi to continue the story and eventually steer it toward redemption. The existence of this later version, however, does not diminish the significance of the original ending. Instead, it underscores the intensity of the anxieties that shaped it. The gallows in Pinocchio represent the ultimate expression of a society's fear of deception, a symbolic execution of the child's untamed impulses, and a warning that dishonesty threatens not only the individual but the social order itself. From the earliest pages of Collodi's narrative, the blue fairy emerges not as a benevolent, magical savior, but as a figure whose authority is intimately tied to judgment, surveillance, and coercion. Unlike modern adaptations that soften her role into that of a protective maternal figure, the original text depicts her as a rigorous enforcer of moral order, one whose interventions are conditional, exacting, and deeply tied to societal norms of discipline. Her presence illustrates that Collodi's narrative is not simply about adventure or whimsy. It is about control, testing, and the shaping of behavior through both reward and threat. The blue fairy's tests of honesty, her careful observation of Pinocchio's choices, and her strategic interventions all mirror the mechanisms of parental, educational, and institutional authority prevalent in 19th-century Italy, emphasizing that moral guidance is inseparable from social oversight. The blue fairy functions primarily as a moral mirror, reflecting back to Pinocchio the consequences of his own dishonesty and impulsiveness. She observes, questions, and evaluates, requiring that the puppet account for his behavior before she intervenes. This mirrors contemporary practices of child supervision, in which authority figures were expected to monitor not only overt acts of misbehavior, but also the intentions and internal honesty of the child. In the society that shaped Collodi, parents and educators did not merely react to disobedience. They anticipated it, probing children's statements for truthfulness and measuring compliance against the ideals of proper conduct. The blue fairy's constant scrutiny reflects this cultural expectation. Children were never free from observation, and moral lapses were never private. Through her, Collodi dramatizes the psychological pressure of living under vigilant authority, where every untruth could be detected, evaluated, and punished or rewarded accordingly. Her enforcement mechanisms are both punitive and incentivizing, underscoring the dual nature of discipline in the era. When Pinocchio lies, she imposes consequences, allowing natural or supernatural outcomes to unfold that reinforce the dangers of deception. When he tells the truth, she provides immediate rewards, granting small reprieves or tangible benefits that encourage compliance. This dual approach mirrors contemporary pedagogical strategies, which combined punishment and reinforcement to shape behavior. Italian educational manuals of the period often recommended balancing correction with reward to cultivate both fear of wrongdoing and desire for virtue. The blue fairy's actions enact this principle within narrative form, teaching that honesty is not only a moral imperative but also a practical strategy for survival. Yet the coercive nature of her guidance is crucial. The blue fairy does not simply instruct. She manipulates circumstances to ensure that Pinocchio confronts his failings. Her interventions are calculated. She withholds assistance until he demonstrates honesty. She allows danger to arise when he is dishonest, and she orchestrates situations in which failure becomes instructive. In doing so, Collodi transforms the story into a controlled experiment on morality, with the blue fairy functioning as an arbiter who ensures that every lie is met with learning. The puppet's agency is constrained. He is free to act, but only within a moral framework that guarantees consequences. This mirrors the broader societal approach to children at the time, where autonomy was tolerated only insofar as it conformed to structured expectations. Her role also reflects the gendered expectations embedded in moral authority. While Collodi's male characters frequently embody mischief, impulsiveness, or exploitation, the blue fairy represents a maternalized moral standard, firm, omniscient, and unyielding. Yet, unlike contemporary depictions of maternal warmth, her authority is neither sentimental nor protective. She embodies a form of disciplined care designed to correct, evaluate, and shape, rather than to comfort unconditionally. This mirrors cultural patterns in which women, particularly mothers and governesses, were often tasked with cultivating obedience, honesty, and virtue in children through constant supervision and strategic enforcement. The narrative, therefore, encodes social and gendered hierarchies within its moral architecture. Furthermore, the blue fairy's interventions illustrate the concept of moral testing as a societal expectation. In Collodi's world, children were constantly subject to evaluation, whether through formal schooling, religious observance, or parental guidance. dishonesty, impulsivity, or moral deviation triggered scrutiny and necessitated corrective action. The Blue Fairy's tests of honesty, her insistence that Pinocchio confess, confront consequences, and demonstrate reform, reflect this culture of constant moral examination. She ensures that lessons are not abstract but lived, that dishonesty carries immediate personal and social ramifications. In this sense, she is less a magical rescuer than a narrative embodiment of institutional control, a figure who maintains social and moral order by ensuring that the child internalizes consequences and aligns behavior with expectations. Even the rewards she grants are instrumental rather than purely benevolent. They function as reinforcement mechanisms, signaling that moral behavior produces practical advantages while maintaining the broader disciplinary context. Collodi's emphasis on reward and punishment reflects the era's understanding that children's morality required both deterrence and incentive. The narrative treats these interventions seriously. The consequences of deceit are never trivialized, and the benefits of honesty are never abstracted from practical survival. The Blue Fairy's approach mirrors this pedagogical philosophy. Morality is inseparable from vigilance, accountability, and tangible outcomes. While earlier sections have emphasized the moral, religious, and disciplinary frameworks that shaped Pinocchio's lies, it is equally important to recognize the social and material pressures that compelled his deceit. Collodi's puppet is not only a moralized figure, but also a character navigating a harsh, unforgiving world where survival is never guaranteed. Hunger, exploitation, and social manipulation converge to create circumstances in which lying is not merely a moral lapse, but a practical response to immediate threats. In this sense, Pinocchio's dishonesty reflects a darker, more realistic dimension of human behavior, the idea that deception is often a strategy for navigating scarcity, danger, and the demands of a society that rewards cunning while punishing weakness. The puppet's early encounters with the world illustrate this dynamic vividly. Thrust into situations where basic needs, food, shelter, and safety, are uncertain, Pinocchio must make choices that straddle the line between necessity and moral failure. When faced with hunger, he lies, steals, or flees, actions that modern readers may judge as improper, but which, in the context of his environment, are instinctive survival strategies. Collodi does not depict these acts as random or whimsical. They are structured within the narrative to show a direct relationship between deprivation and deceit. The story suggests that dishonesty is not always an innate moral flaw, but a response to material conditions that threaten life itself. Collodi's world is populated with figures who exploit the puppet's naivety and desperation. The fox and the cat, for instance, manipulate Pinocchio with promises of wealth and opportunity, preying on his immediate needs and trust. Their schemes illustrate a cruel reality, a society in which those more cunning can exploit the weak, forcing even the innocent to adopt deception as a defensive mechanism. Pinocchio's lies in response to such manipulation are not calculated acts of malice, but instinctive measures to preserve agency and avoid victimization. In this light, the narrative acknowledges that dishonesty can emerge from asymmetric power dynamics, where survival requires navigating deceitful or coercive influences. Hunger, in particular, functions as a recurring motivator for Pinocchio's dishonesty. In 19th-century Italy, food scarcity and poverty were common, and Collodi's audience would have recognized the connection between deprivation and desperate behavior. Pinocchio's repeated misadventures, seeking sustenance, attempting to escape exploitation, or responding to unmet needs, mirror real-life pressures faced by children in economically unstable environments. His lies, while framed as moral failings, also function as adaptive responses. The narrative thus conveys a complex moral lesson. Dishonesty is condemned, yet it emerges predictably when survival is at stake. This dimension of the story intersects with social commentary on manipulation and exploitation. Collodi's puppet is constantly confronted with characters who demand trust, obedience, or compliance under false pretenses. Each encounter tests his judgment, forcing him to weigh immediate gratification against long-term moral instruction. Lies become tools for navigating these pressures, ways to maintain agency and protect oneself in a world where innocence is not enough. The interplay between external coercion and internal impulse reinforces the idea that moral behavior is inseparable from social conditions. Pinocchio's dishonesty, in other words, cannot be fully understood without considering the environment that shapes it. The narrative also emphasizes the psychological consequences of survival-driven deceit. Pinocchio experiences guilt, fear, and shame, emotions intensified by the moral frameworks imposed by figures such as the Blue Fairy. These feelings demonstrate that even when lies serve practical purposes, they carry ethical and social costs. Collodi's work suggests that dishonesty, while sometimes necessary for survival, cannot be entirely disentangled from conscience. The puppet's repeated moral reckonings reflect the tension between instinct and instruction, between immediate needs and the societal and religious standards that demand truthfulness. In this sense, the story captures a nuanced truth. Lying may protect the body in the short term, but often threatens social and moral cohesion over time. By situating dishonesty within the context of hardship, Collodi complicates the simplistic moral dichotomy of truth versus falsehood. The puppet's actions are never purely symbolic. They reflect the lived experiences of children in vulnerable circumstances, children forced to navigate a world where resources are limited, adults are unpredictable, and safety is uncertain. Dishonesty becomes a survival mechanism, a strategy for negotiating risk, and a response to systemic pressures beyond the child's control. Collodi's depiction aligns with historical realities of his time, emphasizing that moral development cannot be divorced from material and social conditions. At the same time, the story continues to enforce societal expectations. Survival-driven dishonesty is permitted only insofar as it leads to eventual recognition of truth, contrition, and moral growth. Pinocchio's lies provoke consequences, whether the physical punishment of a growing nose, threats of execution, or exposure to tricksters, that teach the lesson that deception carries inherent risks. Collodi's narrative thus maintains its disciplinary function while acknowledging that dishonesty often arises from necessity rather than innate corruption. The puppet's journey demonstrates the complex calculus of moral development in a world where survival, manipulation, and ethical instruction are intertwined. Ultimately, this framing deepens the story's resonance. Pinocchio is punished not solely for lying, but for failing to navigate the ethical and practical demands of his environment responsibly. His dishonesty is simultaneously a moral and pragmatic act, revealing both the societal pressures that compel deceit and the enduring cultural expectation that truthfulness is a measure of human virtue. Collodi captures the tension between instinct and instruction, necessity and conscience, vulnerability and societal oversight. In this way, the narrative acknowledges that lying is not always a simple moral failing. It is often a response to circumstances that test the limits of agency, resourcefulness, and resilience. Pinocchio's struggles remind readers that moral evaluation cannot occur in isolation from social context. By embedding his character within a world marked by scarcity, exploitation, and coercion, Collodi exposes the darker dimensions of human survival. Dishonesty emerges as a complex response, shaped by hunger, fear, and manipulation, yet always framed within a moral universe that emphasizes accountability, correction, and eventual growth. In this synthesis, the puppet's journey reflects the paradox of childhood in a harsh world. The instinct to lie may be natural, necessary, and even protective, but it is inseparable from the social, moral, and spiritual frameworks that define the limits of acceptable conduct. Pinocchio survives not simply by avoiding punishment, but by learning to negotiate these pressures, transforming instinct-driven deception into an understanding of responsibility and conscience. The culmination of Pinocchio's journey is often interpreted in modern adaptations as a heartwarming transformation. The puppet becomes a real boy, achieves happiness, and earns societal acceptance. Yet Collodi's original narrative frames this metamorphosis with rigorous conditions, emphasizing that it is neither automatic nor unconditional. Becoming real is not a reward for adventure, cleverness, or charm. It is the result of sustained obedience, conformity to social norms, and the complete renunciation of deceit. In this sense, the story reflects the 19th century ideal of moral development, in which the child must submit fully to societal and religious authority, internalize its expectations, and demonstrate that personal desires can be subordinated to a higher moral order. The good boy ideal, therefore, is less a celebration of childhood than a blueprint for disciplined adulthood. Obedience is the central prerequisite for transformation. From the earliest chapters, Pinocchio's failures are attributed to his refusal or inability to follow guidance, whether from Geppetto, the blue fairy, or other authority figures. Each act of disobedience triggers consequences that escalate in severity, signaling that moral growth is impossible without adherence to rules. Collodi's narrative thus reinforces the idea that children's freedom must be structured and supervised, a principle widely accepted in 19th century pedagogy. Obedience is presented not as passive submission but as a test of moral readiness. The child must consistently choose the correct path, even when it conflicts with immediate desires or instinctual impulses. Only through repeated compliance does the possibility of realness emerge. Conformity to societal norms complements obedience as a requirement for transformation. Pinocchio's misadventures illustrate the consequences of divergence. Running away, consorting with tricksters, or pursuing pleasure over duty exposes him to danger, exploitation, and moral compromise. Collodi's narrative communicates that personal whims must yield to collective expectations, that the individual is measured against standards imposed by family, community, and moral authority. The real boy is not merely someone who speaks and moves like a human, but someone who aligns thought, action, and social behavior with established rules. In this sense, the story reflects broader social anxieties of post-unification Italy, a period in which conformity was prized as a mechanism for stabilizing a society fractured by regionalism, political turbulence, and inconsistent cultural norms. Total rejection of deceit is equally critical to achieving transformation. Dishonesty, which had driven much of Pinocchio's misfortune, must be fully abandoned for moral and social legitimacy to be attained. The growing nose, symbolic of exposure and shame, ceases to serve its function only when Pinocchio internalizes the principle that lies are unacceptable. This aligns with the period's educational and religious emphasis on truth-telling as the cornerstone of moral character. Collodi's audience would have recognized that integrity is not a superficial trait, but a measure of the soul's alignment with divine and societal order. The puppet's final success is therefore contingent on more than obedience. It requires an internal moral recalibration in which deceit is actively renounced, guilt is acknowledged, and conscience guides action. The transformation also reflects a complex interplay between reward and moral labor. Becoming real is presented not as a gift for passive endurance, but as the result of cumulative effort. Pinocchio's trials, hunger, manipulation, moral testing, and exposure function as preparatory exercises, conditioning him to internalize obedience, conformity, and honesty. Collodi's narrative frames these hardships as necessary training, producing a moral rigor that is rewarded only upon completion. This approach mirrors contemporary pedagogical philosophies that view discipline and hardship as essential to shaping character. Childhood was not idealized as a time of innocence or play, but as a stage of rigorous moral apprenticeship in which the successful individual emerges disciplined, responsible, and socially integrated. Psychologically, the story suggests that moral transformation requires self-mastery. Pinocchio's impulses, desire, fear, imagination, and instinct must be tempered by conscious choice. Becoming a real boy involves the subordination of immediate gratification to the demands of authority and social expectation. Collodi dramatizes this process by repeatedly placing Pinocchio in situations where moral failure produces visible consequences, such as physical danger, shame, or humiliation. Through these trials, the puppet gradually internalizes the standards he must meet. Obedience, conformity, and honesty are no longer externally enforced alone. They become components of his emerging identity, shaping cognition, motivation, and self-perception. The narrative portrays moral maturation as a process of internalizing authority so completely that it directs behavior spontaneously, rather than through fear or coercion alone. This framing situates the transformation within a broader cultural discourse about the purpose of childhood. In Collodi's Italy, children were seen as inherently pliable but potentially corruptible. The goal of upbringing, both at home and in schools, was to mold children into productive, socially responsible adults. The narrative's insistence that Pinocchio must meet exacting standards before becoming real embodies this philosophy. Moral development is not optional or gradual. It is an imperative with clearly defined benchmarks. The puppet's journey dramatizes the societal expectation that the child must be disciplined, guided, and corrected before being fully recognized as a capable, autonomous human being. Moreover, the transformation illustrates the intertwining of moral and social legitimacy. Pinocchio's humanity is conditional not merely on personal virtue, but on acceptance within a moralized social order. By demonstrating obedience, conformity, and honesty, he earns inclusion within the frameworks of family, community, and society at large. Collodi's narrative emphasizes that morality is inseparable from social integration. To be real is to be both ethically aligned and socially sanctioned. The puppet's metamorphosis is thus emblematic of a culture in which identity, moral development, and social survival are interdependent, reflecting anxieties about discipline, trust, and order in post-unification Italian society. By the mid-20th century, Pinocchio had transformed from a stark morality tale into a family-friendly icon, largely due to the influence of Walt Disney's 1940 animated adaptation. Where Collodi's original narrative confronted readers with the harsh consequences of dishonesty, poverty, manipulation, and moral failure, Disney reimagined the story as a whimsical adventure in which misbehavior is softened, danger is mitigated, and moral lessons are simplified. The result is a cultural erasure of the disturbing origins embedded within Collodi's text, a sanitization that recast a story steeped in 19th-century anxieties about childhood, obedience, and social morality into light-hearted entertainment suitable for mass audiences. Understanding this transformation requires examining the historical, cultural, and industrial factors that enabled Disney to strip the tale of its punitive, psychologically and socially complex layers. Collodi's Pinocchio was a product of a world in which childhood was feared as much as it was cherished. Lies were dangerous, impulses needed control, and moral development demanded constant surveillance. The narrative's tension arose from the collision between the child's instinctual behavior and societal expectations, often culminating in extreme consequences such as exposure, shame, and even execution. The puppet's lies, acts of disobedience, and naive ventures into a perilous world were intended to terrify as well as instruct. By contrast, Disney's adaptation emerged in an era that valued childhood innocence, optimism, and entertainment as economic and cultural commodities. The dark moral rigor that characterized Collodi's text was incompatible with a vision of family cinema designed to appeal across age groups, markets, and cultures. Consequently, the narrative underwent a profound transformation, one that reoriented the story around adventure, humor, and emotional sentiment rather than fear, punishment, and moral surveillance. One of the most significant changes introduced by Disney was the removal of overtly violent or fatal consequences. In Collodi's original, Pinocchio faces threats that include hanging, starvation, and exposure to predators, real dangers meant to undo the severity of lying. Disney reframed these incidents into perilous, but ultimately survivable adventures. The puppet's encounters with antagonists such as the fox and the cat, or his time in Pleasure Island, are dangerous yet softened, emphasizing excitement and suspense rather than moral terror. The narrative no longer punishes deceit with exposure or near-death experiences. Instead, consequences are immediate, reversible, and instructive in a way that prioritizes engagement and entertainment over existential threat. The extreme moral stakes, which made Collodi's story disturbing and compelling, were therefore diluted to suit the demands of mass media consumption. Equally important was the alteration of character motivation and psychology. Collodi's Pinocchio lies not only out of mischief but from fear, hunger, and social vulnerability, circumstances that reveal the darker social truths underpinning dishonesty. Disney's adaptation reorients these lies as playful, impulsive mischief or naive errors, rather than responses to survival pressures. The puppet becomes a more archetypal child figure whose moral failings are amusing, easily corrected, and ultimately excused by charm and sincerity. By reframing dishonesty as an innocent misstep rather than a symptom of social or psychological complexity, Disney eliminated the uncomfortable acknowledgement that deception often emerges from necessity, coercion, or fear, an acknowledgement central to Collodi's original cautionary vision. The Blue Fairy's role was also significantly transformed. In Collodi's text, she is a moral enforcer, a figure of surveillance, coercion, and judgment whose interventions are conditional and designed to compel obedience and repentance. Disney's Blue Fairy, by contrast, assumes a maternalized, nurturing function. Her authority is softened. She appears less as a disciplinarian monitoring moral lapses, and more as a guiding presence rewarding innate goodness. The psychological tension of accountability is replaced by reassurance and encouragement. This change removes the narrative weight of moral coercion, transforming the story's exploration of guilt, punishment, and repentance into a tale of aspirational self-improvement. The unsettling pressures that Collodi's readers might have felt, the constant gaze of authority and the threat of public or divine judgment, are replaced with emotional support, creating a far more comforting, commercially viable narrative. Disney also emphasized sentimental and emotional arcs over social critique. The original text engages deeply with societal anxieties, children's vulnerability to manipulation, the dangers of dishonesty, and the consequences of moral failure in a harsh social landscape. These concerns, grounded in 19th-century Italian society, were largely erased. Collodi's narrative reflected post-unification anxieties about education, obedience, and the regulation of childhood behavior, drawing on fears that children were naturally inclined to deception, impulsiveness, and even criminality. Disney's adaptation reframed these elements as playful adventures and personal growth, ignoring the socio-historical pressures that shaped Collodi's moral universe. In doing so, the adaptation transformed a socially and morally complex story into a narrative that prioritized emotional resonance, visual spectacle, and marketable entertainment. The aesthetic transformation was equally significant. Collodi's illustrations, often stark and macabre, emphasized the grotesque consequences of misbehavior, while the original text conveyed moral severity through tone, imagery, and narrative tension. Disney replaced these elements with vivid colors, fluid animation, and whimsical designs, ensuring that danger and failure were visually softened. The puppet's nose grows in a stylized, humorous manner rather than as a grotesque mark of shame, and perilous scenarios are rendered in ways that prioritize excitement over horror. This aesthetic sanitization reinforced the narrative shift from moral warning to entertainment spectacle, further obscuring the story's original function as a cautionary tale of dishonesty and its consequences. Cultural context played a key role in this transformation. Disney was producing during an era that idealized childhood as a period of innocence and imaginative exploration. Moral complexity and existential threat were less appealing to audiences seeking optimism during a period of economic recovery and global tension. Collodi's story, steeped in disciplinary rigor and social anxiety, conflicted with these sensibilities. By softening threats, emphasizing adventure, and romanticizing the Blue Fairy, Disney aligned the story with contemporary expectations of family entertainment. The shift illustrates how industrial and cultural imperatives, market demand, audience sensibilities, and the economics of animation can erase the darker social and moral truths embedded in literary texts. This erasure had long-term consequences for cultural memory. Collodi's original audience was confronted with a narrative that demanded reflection on social vulnerability, moral responsibility, and the consequences of dishonesty. Disney's adaptation, while beloved, encouraged a more superficial engagement with the story. Audiences were charmed by anthropomorphized characters, enchanting music, and a satisfying resolution, largely oblivious to the narrative's punitive, socially critical origins. The transformation underscores how adaptations can simultaneously preserve and obscure literary heritage, producing versions of stories that are culturally pervasive yet historically detached from their original moral, psychological, and social frameworks. The enduring fascination with Pinocchio, particularly the unsettling power of his lies, stems from the story's ability to tap into anxieties that remain surprisingly relevant even in the modern world. While contemporary audiences are more likely to encounter Disney's sanitized version, the original narrative crafted by Carlo Collodi continues to resonate because it exposes universal and persistent fears about the moral development of children, the fragility of truth, and the consequences of deceit. Pinocchio's lies disturb not merely because they defy authority, but because they highlight the tension between instinct and expectation, freedom and control, and the natural inclinations of childhood versus the demands of society. In examining why these lies retain their capacity to unsettle, one must consider both the historical context of their creation and their resonance with ongoing cultural anxieties. Collodi's Italy, with its post-unification turbulence, political uncertainty, and rigorous moral expectations, produced a worldview in which dishonesty was perceived as a symptom of broader social instability. Lying was not a minor flaw to be tolerated. It was a threat to family cohesion, civic trust, and religious order. By embedding these fears into the narrative, Collodi made Pinocchio's lies a microcosm of societal anxieties. The puppet's misbehavior is amplified because it is situated within a world where deception has tangible consequences, a world in which moral failure is visible, public, and capable of triggering danger or shame. The discomfort modern readers feel when revisiting the original story arises from an instinctive recognition of these stakes. Dishonesty is portrayed as both a personal and a social threat, echoing contemporary concerns about accountability, trust, and the ethical development of the next generation. The psychological dimension of Pinocchio's lies contributes to their lasting impact. Collodi understood that children are not inherently rational agents. They are impulsive, curious, and often guided by self-interest. His narrative confronts readers with the unsettling notion that these natural impulses, if unchecked, can lead to grave consequences. The puppet's growing nose, the threat of execution, and repeated entanglements with tricksters symbolize the enduring tension between instinct and instruction, a tension that is still relevant in modern discussions about child-rearing, education, and the development of moral reasoning. Parents, educators, and psychologists continue to grapple with questions that Pinocchio dramatizes. How much freedom should be afforded to children? To what extent should truth be enforced? And how should deceit be addressed in a way that balances accountability with understanding? The societal pressures depicted in Collodi's narrative mirror contemporary anxieties about manipulation and exploitation. Pinocchio is repeatedly confronted with figures who prey upon his naivety, from the fox and the cat to exploitative adults in various guises. These encounters dramatize a fear that children are vulnerable to deception, that their moral and physical safety depends on guidance, and that lying may emerge as both a defensive response and a moral failure. Modern readers, aware of issues such as bullying, digital manipulation, and the complexity of moral choices in childhood, recognize in Pinocchio's struggles a prescient illustration of these dynamics. The discomfort lies in seeing that dishonesty is not merely a personal flaw, but often a response to external pressures, an insight that resonates across time and culture. Religious and moral symbolism also ensures that Pinocchio's lies remain disturbing. In Collodi's text, lying carries consequences that extend beyond the immediate. Exposure, shame, and the potential for punishment by authority figures under a moral universe in which truth-telling is both a social necessity and a spiritual imperative. Modern readers, even when removed from the Catholic framework that shaped the original, sense the weight of these moral expectations. Lies are unsettling not simply because they deceive, but because they violate an implicit social contract and suggest the presence of unseen forces, parental, institutional, or spiritual, that demand accountability. The narrative evokes anxiety by illustrating that dishonesty threatens both social cohesion and moral integrity. The contrast between Collodi's severe moral framework and modern, often permissive approaches to childhood amplifies the disturbing nature of the original lies. Contemporary culture frequently emphasizes understanding, empathy, and the contextualization of misbehavior, framing dishonesty as a learning opportunity rather than a moral emergency. When readers encounter Collodi's punitive logic, hanging, public exposure, and symbolic shaming, they are confronted with a more absolutist moral universe, one in which the stakes of lying are existential. This juxtaposition highlights the enduring tension between instinctive behavior and the demands of society, a tension that continues to inform debates about education, parenting, and ethics. Collodi's enduring influence is also evident in the way Pinocchio functions as a metaphor for broader human fears. Lies in the story are never isolated. They ripple outward, affecting social relationships, moral standing, and personal survival. This interconnectedness mirrors contemporary anxieties about the consequences of dishonesty in a highly interconnected society, where deception can spread quickly and undermine trust. The puppet struggles remind readers that the act of lying is never purely private, and that ethical development is inseparable from social responsibility. The discomfort arises from recognizing that the dynamics Collodi depicted, temptation, manipulation, and consequence, remain present in modern life. Finally, the narrative's capacity to disturb rests on its unflinching realism within the framework of fantasy. Pinocchio is simultaneously magical and profoundly human. His wooden body does not exempt him from moral law, and his adventures, while whimsical, carry real stakes. Collodi's lies are therefore unsettling because they occur within a world that feels both familiar and morally uncompromising. Readers experience tension between the safe pleasures of fantasy and the relentless logic of the moral universe. This tension ensures that the story remains compelling and, in its original form, haunting. The lies are not mere plot devices. They are instruments for exploring fear, guilt, accountability, and the ethical demands placed on children, concepts that remain deeply relevant in the modern imagination. In conclusion, the disturbing power of Pinocchio's lies endures because they crystallize the intersection of personal impulse, social expectation, and moral consequence. Collodi's narrative confronts readers with the harsh realities of childhood, the vulnerability of the inexperienced, and the moral imperatives of honesty, obedience, and accountability. Modern anxieties about manipulation, the ethical development of children, and the consequences of deceit echo the fears that informed the original text. Even as adaptations have softened the story into family-friendly entertainment, the underlying truths of Collodi's moral universe, where lies have weight, deception carries danger, and obedience ensures survival, continue to resonate, reminding contemporary audiences that the lessons of the wooden puppet remain as potent and unsettling as they were over a century ago.